Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring one of the drivers of human behaviour, the environments we live and work in, and the tools that we use to live our lives, and in particular, how those are designed. Design shapes the environments in which we make decisions, from the layout of a workspace to the interface of an app. Design influences the choices we make. If we get design wrong, we increase human risk by nudging people towards poor decisions and creating unintended consequences. But if we get it right, we create systems and environments that help people make better, safer, and more ethical choices, and thereby reduce human risk. To explore this subject, I'm joined by two guests from the Stanford D.school, officially the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. The D.school is a world-renowned hub where students from all disciplines come together to tackle complex problems through creative, design-driven approaches. It's a place that nurtures unconventional thinking, and students learn to apply design thinking to real-world challenges across industries, from technology to social impact. And my guests are Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley. Carissa is a designer, geoscientist, and the academic director at the D.school. She teaches design courses on emerging tech, climate change, and data visualization. And Scott is a writer, designer, and the creative director at the D.school. He's overseen everything from books to workspaces to digital products and initiatives focused on the future of learning and design. And together, Carissa and Scott have written a book called Assembling Tomorrow, which explores how design shapes the future, particularly in the light of the rapid rise of emerging tech like AI and synthetic biology. In our discussion, we look at how these technologies influence human behavior and decision-making. We talk about how design can either help or hinder our ability to navigate a world that's becoming increasingly unpredictable, and why it's essential to consider the ethical and practical implications of the things we create. Carissa and Scott share their insights on what they call mischievous materials and how design often starts as fiction, evolving into real-world innovations. We look at how speculative fiction can help us imagine the future consequences of today's decision, and how emotions, make-believe, and interconnections play a significant role in the design process. The book they've written is absolutely fascinating, as is the discussion. I thought this was really, really interesting, and I think you would as well. Before we begin, just a warning that thanks to a technical glitch, some of Scott's audio didn't render properly, so it's a little distorted in parts. I've done what I can to enhance it, but it's not always up to the high standards that I'd like to set for this show. As ever, it's the quality of conversation that's prioritized over the quality of the audio, though I do like to have both. So apologies in advance for those sections, but bear with them because what Scott has to say is fascinating, and the distorted parts are very brief and don't detract from his overall message. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley on Assembling Tomorrow. Scott and Carissa, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Christian.
I'm so excited to have you both here because you've written the most amazing book called Assembling Tomorrow. And I just wanted to start off by saying, can you tell us what that's about? What was the genesis of that?
Yeah, I mean, Scott and I are both educators and we're in the field of making things and teaching other people how to make things that are then launched into the world. And the reality, right, is that today's world feels wild and quite unsettling. We have technologies like algorithms that can replicate on their own and cause massive change very quickly. Our climate's in dire straits. It can really feel like the world is happening to us. So even to us as educators of people that, are putting things into the world, it feels that way. And so we said, hey, let's write a book about this moment and about the agency that we know that each of us has.
When you talk in those terms, from my perspective, the world does seem confusing and everything's changing. But I read it and I sort of thought that's interesting that people in the world of design, who I would have thought would have been open-minded and able to spot, you would spot things that I wouldn't spot. So I'd always seen the world of the artist and the designer as being lots of things going on at the same time. So I was I get it from the average person's perspective, but I was quite surprised that you as designers had spotted that, because I've always got this impression that the world of design is about thinking, also spotting unusual things, and therefore the world isn't predictable and straight. And so even from the designer's perspective, the world feels a bit crazy.
Yeah, we think of design in some ways as being about navigating ambiguity in the first place. So it's a method for learning from the world so you can figure out what to do in a situation where the answer is not obvious. So you're very right on that. At the same time, Carissa coined this phrase, mischievous materials. We think there's something about the materials that we're working with these days, whether it's generative AI or synthetic biology, which we call artificial evolution. There's something about them that's different and is creating a situation where we can't quite see the effects of what we're creating in the same way we could in the past, right? You build a car runs into a wall, the car smashes, you see the problem. With social media and algorithms that are trying to get engagement, it's much less clear. In fact, there are still arguments that people are having that we can't prove the causality of social media on, say, like teen depression, which seems very obvious. They're still having trouble proving the causality of it.
And so the human race implicitly has got beyond itself, right? We don't have the capability to see what's going on. And so I guess you're saying, well, we need to think differently about how we do these things and step back a second because the normal controls on things going wrong, which is the visibility piece. And I guess the timing of when things go wrong, there used to be a greater immediacy. Because of all those dynamics, we need to look at things a bit differently. Is that the way to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think none of us can ever see the full picture. And that's even more so today. There's too much to see. There are so many ways to sense the world. Each one of us has our own slice of experience. And just given that backdrop and the power of technology to create a lot of change really quickly, that's the reality of our world. So we have to learn how to navigate that, as Scott's saying, navigate that ambiguity.
And you begin the book by talking about some of the dynamics that we might not think of that drive the way the world operates. Can you talk a little bit? How did you identify what those were?
Yeah, they're definitely more than we identified. So we're missing things as we're talking about what people are missing. But we did four. Two of them are really about people and how we interpret things. Those are emotions and make believe. And this idea that emotions play a bigger role than we think. And so we need to factor them into the designs. And make believe is the idea that we like to fill in the blanks and it helps us get through the world. And, in behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, you can see that these things have, they help us move quickly, but they often give us some misunderstandings in how we operate or biases. Then we had two others that are really about how the world works. Those are interconnections, which again are hard for people to see. Much easier to see a fixed object than it is the evolution of that object. And flow, which is about the movement of things, the way things interconnect and the way speed changes everything. We don't see that as easily either. So these are all things where the gap between how people see the world and the way the world works are pretty extreme. And so we wanted to isolate those just to say that, like, how do we get better at seeing these things? Because these are the things that are causing the trouble. We're working with these materials that work in these spheres and we can't see it happening.
And so really this is looking at you've pointed to the fact that this is beneficial to right. It's what's enabled many of these things are what have enabled us as a species to survive. So the cognitive biases, but you're really saying, I guess these flaws are particularly dangerous at the moment, given the dynamics you were talking about before.
Yeah, and maybe they're not flaws, but it's not necessarily what we're tuned to, right? And another title for our book could be How to See the Unseen or the Unseeable, right? And so how do we tune ourselves into each of those different four layers, as Scott was mentioning?
I do think there's something about talking about
Mm.
them as flaws or features. Like in software development, there's this sort of like, is it a feature or is it a bug? Well,
Mm.
actually, they're both. It's a feature in one circumstance and a bug in another.
I mean, it always struck me as it's the equivalent of we talk about when we create drugs, it's always a side effect. And of course, side effects don't exist as a concept. That's just stuff you didn't want to have happen that's part of it.
And they're just effects.
So I thought it was interesting as I looked at the sort of the dynamics. It's pretty scary when you start to look at those things because you kind of just go, we're a bit helpless here. And of course, that's the start of the book, right? So you are going to help to try and solve the problem. But I had this real sense of, and a lot of the stuff you're pointing out, it was either things I knew or things that once you pointed them out to me became obvious. That beautiful thing where we're able to. So And I just thought it's quite a terrifying start in some respects, because it does feel like we're incredibly helpless. As you were looking at the book, was that something that you were thinking, that this is actually so challenging that it's worth unpicking in those senses? And it's very uncomfortable, I guess, is what I'm saying. Is when I was reading it, I was sort of thinking, this is quite difficult. I mean, it paints a very bleak picture, I guess, of where we're at.
I mean, I think that the drama is a key piece of it for us, because we also feel like sometimes with a lot of new technology being released into the world, the narrative that can get spread is like, this is fantastic. This is going to fix everything. There comes a lot of hubris with putting new things out there. Everybody like wants their new app, their new, Gen AI tool to succeed. But the reality is that the world's more complex than that. And the feature flaw combo from before is spot on. There's both positives and negatives, long-term and short-term consequences for everything we put in the world. And it's all of our jobs to shepherd what we create into the future in a way that that makes it better, that makes the world better. It will never be perfect, but we can always be watching out for those unintended consequences.
And it struck me that as you were looking at some of the sort of, particularly the world of tech, the people who have control of that tend to be younger and less experienced. And so one of the ways that we might, as a species, calibrate things is to put control of things in the hands of people that have at least a little bit of life experience. And of course, one of the things that we see with the tech companies is that tends to be very, very young people driving that with little life experience, and who are given a lot of backing by possibly people that should know better. So we've kind of created, not only are the tools they're playing with potentially very dangerous, but actually we've probably got the wrong people in charge of them, I might argue.
That's a fascinating, even if they have good intentions, right? They're so excited about the potential. And I do think, as you're talking about it, I'm getting older. I'm getting
Are
up
we all,
there.
Scott? Are
Good way
we
to
all,
put
right?
it. I mean, I think in general, the thing we're trying to say is that as you're talking about it, why we are, I guess we are, yeah. Yeah, as we're talking about it, there is an ethos of let's see what it can do. Let's live up to the potential. Let's create every possibility there could be. And that is part of it. We need that engine and that motion and people seeing possibility. But then on the other hand, if you're just looking at what can be, you're not paying attention to what should be. And I do think there is something about age that really puts you into a category of like, let's not just do it because we could, let's do it because we should. And that's a very different perspective. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think that's an interesting point.
And I want to push back on the age comment though, because we have college students all around us all the time. That's who's in our class. They're 18 to 25, 26, 27. These students are so eager to build a better world than the one that they have inherited. So, whatever the state of today's tech companies, we could hash that out, but I don't think that'll make super interesting listening for your listeners. Uh, I I think that the younger generation is holding the older one to task, and I don't think that we can rely on the people who created the problems of today to necessarily fix them. Right, there's that cognitive diversity, but also just like a myopic focus on one thing and like one feature and like spreading that versus, seeing the big picture of what might be possible and like picking that intention wisely. I just don't think that's connected with age, but
I love that. It's very fair challenge. I guess I'm pointing, possibly if I'm being a bit more reasonable, I'd be pointing to sort of cognitive diversity and saying that
Mhm.
potentially for some of these things that are causing problems, there's potentially concentration in the wrong hands. And that's not necessarily an age thing.
Christian, I think your point about side effects are just effects by another name. I think that sums it all up, right? And who's going to be comfortable with all the effects, right? There are certain people who are like, I'm only working toward these effects, so those other effects don't count. Those are side effects, right? Those aren't my responsibility. And I think what Chris is getting at, which I see in our students as well, is they're game to look at all the effects at once, and just say like, okay, if I do a thing, it's going to create these impacts, and those are all part of the design. And so I'm happy to move forward with them.
Speaking of seeing the full impact, you do something which I thought was wonderful, is you bring in what I'd loosely term science fiction. So you take us ahead to the future and you tell some stories, and that it reminded me of Black Mirror. I don't know if you've seen that series on Netflix, and it's not quite as dark as that, but you're looking ahead and saying, let's go to the future and let's see what the world could look like, and let's see what we think of that. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that narrative device, because I thought it reminded me of the idea of a pre-mortem that we've seen in business, which is, imagine it's gone wrong, let's talk about how it's gone wrong. How did you come up with that construct? Because I've seen it in sort of in the meeting context, but I love the fact that we've moved from sciencey bit from literally almost, as I was looking at it, from sort of science or economics through to then what I would term science fiction. I wasn't expecting it, and it worked really, really well. How did you come up with that?
Yeah. Thank you for noticing that. It's like the part of the book that Scott and I love the most and probably had the most fun in writing. Well, we believe that all design begins as fiction. Everything that is created had to be imagined first. And that power of imagination, it cannot be underestimated. Um, like a great story is the Apple Watch is famously inspired by a Dick Tracy cartoon, right? That's decades of an idea that was just fiction, and it stewed and it stewed and it grew, and all of a sudden it's in the world. And so how do you do that though? And like what can that imagination do for us? So we have these 20 speculative fiction stories that are dotted across our book. And like you said, they allow us to try on moments in the nearish future within the next 50-ish years or so and see how we like them. Do we like how we show up in this future? They're not meant to be, you know, pushing us to extremes, but really to take on everyday moments and see how those moments feel.
How did you? I mean, there were so many things you could have covered. How did you come up with them? Because some of them were very, very, very creative. And I let for example, there's the dating story, and how AI plays. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, because I think it's a really, really good example of it's a little bit far fetched and yet not. And that's what I liked, is you got that nice balance of, well, that's ridiculous, and then you think about it, you go, well, it's actually not that ridiculous. And so there was this lovely. It was close. I guess it was feasible, but not necessarily likely.
Yeah, I want to talk about that story because Scott wrote that story and it allows me to brag on him a little bit. I always cite it as my favorite story in the book because what this story is this moment. It's two people on a date. And one of the characters has an AI in their head that is helping them answer the questions that their date is posing. It's that simple of a premise. And as the story progresses, you just watch this character that's wearing the AI like kind of devolve into a puddle and become unable to really make any kind of thought of their own. It's incredibly comical, but also, as you're saying, you can see it happening. And it makes you wrestle with this idea of what should we be giving technology the power to do? Should it be helping us with these everyday conversations and dates, etc.? Where should that boundary lie? There's a lot of really sophisticated concepts within it, and yet, like, you could see that moment happening pretty soon.
I love the idea of the looking back, which I think makes it's sort of strangely slightly strange narrative because it's simultaneously very accessible and not threatening, and yet it's a sort of it's a great way to get us to think about things without sort of scaring us. And maybe in my reading of the book, I sort of started thinking this world's a bit terrifying, but you kind of it's not a dystopian vision. It's more of a just sort of it's just a very I love the idea of the narrative device that was getting us into a space where it was easier to contemplate these things.
Yeah, we really wanted it to be focused on the day to day. So most of the stories are about human relationships in the era and decision making in the era of these new things coming to life. And in every case, that looking backward idea, that came from a project we did almost 10 years ago, Carissa and I, and some other folks at the D.school, that was looking at the future of on-campus education. And to get the faculty and the president of the university to be able to think big and not get mired in, well, but if we did that, this would happen. We could never do that because this policy, we shot them into a time machine and then created this space where we had all the things that had already existed and what was it like to have had those in the past. We had just everything from people being able to move in and out of college for years rather than just have to study in a 4-year period, to devices that would record your sort of stress level and tell you, where were you stressed? How did that help you or not? All this stuff. And then everybody could look back on it, even though we were talking about, 10 years in the future, 15 years in the future. So we redeployed that for this book. But the idea was just to say, okay, if this happens, let's not just like speculate on what might happen and let our minds go wild. Because when your mind goes wild, it usually goes utopia, dystopia, right? And these are a little bit toward the darker side, a little bit. I think we were exercising our anxiety a little bit in these stories. But really, they're just about everyday moments. Like, okay, let's say this happens. What does that mean with my relationship with my sibling? What does that mean with my relationship with a loved one? What does that mean with my design work that I'm doing out in the day? And really try to follow the decision-making and relationship process to get into like the nitty-gritty of how this is going to change our lives. Rather than just sort of speculation about, oh, everything's going to blow up.
And was it easy to pick stories? Because I could imagine that once you start thinking about these things, there are lots. I mean, if we just look at Hollywood, there are plenty of sort of futuristic stories out there. Was it easy to choose the ones that you put in there? Because it was a lovely eclectic mix of things, and I felt that you covered quite a lot of ground in them. But I imagine to get to that, there's probably quite a few things on the whatever the equivalent of the cutting room floor is for authors. But I imagine there's quite a few things that got left behind.
We had at least double that number of stories that we needed to cut. It's hard to choose what to cut. And, partly it was, let's look across the nonfiction of the book and what feels like the right vibe for right kind of story that brings in the right elements at a certain moment. There's lots of different devices that we used in order to determine which were the ones that are in there. And I think we both also, still hold candles for some of them that didn't make it.
And so that takes us through the science fiction piece. And then the final section of the book is actually looking at solving the problem and what do we need to do to manage these dynamics and think about that. And as I was saying to you before we started recording, the bit that really struck me was if I were to look at it through the lens of sensible advice that adults might give to their kids, there were lots of things you were proposing in the final section of the book that were sort of sounded irresponsible. And you're really encouraging people to think illogically and to break out of traditional models. So I love it. The one that I particularly loved was you encourage people to shapeshift, which I always thought was if you accuse someone of shape shifting, that's an incredibly negative comment, and yet that's the nature of advice. So it was joyous to read, but it was also sort of unconventional advice. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I mean those four actionables, as we call them, are one of them is the shape shifting, as you call out, which is about continuing to change yourself and to change how you're looking at your work, to change like who you're collaborating with and where you get inspiration from. Another one is about embracing awkwardness, which is really about noticing what makes a moment or a situation work or not work, and what are the different vectors that you might pull to alter it. A third is around disorientation. So, how do you disorient yourself and let go of some of the things that you feel like are assumptions as to how a situation should operate, and be able to allow the journey to take you versus you take the journey, for one way to describe it. And then the final one is about aiming for imperfection, which is this acknowledgement that everything we put in the world has the potential to do great things, but to also cause harm and will likely alter the world for somebody, some stakeholder, the planet, in a way that feels not great to them. So, how do you proceed in making things for the better, not losing that spark, but also being careful with what you're building?
And it struck me that this is classic sort of creative thinking, right? Which is let's ignore the normal rules and let's just see where things take us, and let's not worry too much about structure and processes, and just let our imaginations run riot. And I thought that was a lovely antidote to lots of the things that, back to this is slightly unconventional, is that the way I think traditionally we've tried to manage risk in society and deal with it is sort of we try and constrain it, whether that's physically constrain it or economics would be a good example, I think, of trying to sort of make sense of something messy. And we see when that breaks down. And so I love the fact that you were coming at this really through, I guess, literally through a designer's lens. But for me, it was a very sort of artistic, creative view of the world, and therefore made perfect sense given your background.
Yeah, you mentioned as we were getting ready for this podcast, we were chatting a little bit, and you mentioned logic has taken us so far. I'm not anti-logic. I'm not gonna. I'll just go on. I'll be brave and say I'm not anti-logic. However, there is something happening right now where things are becoming a little illogical. So I know some people who are working with generative AI as part of the software that they're building, and it's the exact opposite of the way they worked pre-generative AI. So when you're working on a program, you're basically making a call to a method. The method sends back an argument. You put that argument to use. You know what you expect to get back. Now you send a request, something comes back. You don't know what the content's going to be. It's very kind of organic and spontaneous. And then you have to figure out a way to incorporate that into what you're doing. And it's a complete mind flip. And that's just one example. I mean, we haven't really started talking about synthetic biology, but the idea of programming at the level of DNA, where you're at the base code level, you don't know how that's going to manifest in the world, right? It's going to start creating these proteins. Those proteins start interacting with things. That organism starts interacting with the world. And so we're in a situation that's just a lot more organic, a lot more unpredictable, a lot more spontaneous. And the need to be able to work with that feels like it's going to be different than control. It's going to be about responding. It's going to be about setting limits so things don't kind of go too far in one direction. It's going to be about trying things out and testing rather than kind of predicting what they're going to do and being able to jump in when things go wrong.
And it strikes me, it's very much, it's back to that bug feature thing. If I look back in society, one of the ways that the authorities, whoever they, I don't want to get into conspiracy theory, but whoever they were, would try and stamp down. You'd have rules, and you try and ban things and just prevent them from even appearing. And we know that, of course, that doesn't work. What it sounds like you're saying is well, we kind of need to surf the wave a little bit, right? Let's not pretend the waves aren't there. We have to surf it and then recognize what we're dealing with. And so, in order to be people who can help to shape the future in an intelligent way, I guess we have to understand these dynamics, which is the point of your work, and go with them a little bit and not try and control them in the same way that we might have tried historically, because that's not going to work. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, I think that's exactly what we're talking about, and you can see it. You can see it in the sort of failure of the controls that we put into effect, right? So we have this idea that at a certain point, our systems, whether that's the Earth's biosphere or our own nervous systems, they reach these limits and they become nervous systems, right? They start to break down. They start to not really function appropriately, and that's based on a concept that was implicit in the people designing things, that everything was kind of unlimited. Natural resources are unlimited. Our imaginative capacity is unlimited. I've even heard one of the CEOs of one of the big AI companies say, I believe in the limitless capacity of the human imagination. Well, I too, I teach creativity. I'm very excited about that. There's a point where it reaches a limit. And I think we're starting to see it in our political polarization, in teen mental health. It is not a limitless resource. So when we think of things as limitless, weirdly, we think we can control them. When we start to understand that they are limited, we have to work with them. We have to dance with them. We have to be a little bit more responsive earlier.
And I thought it was like recognize, actually, because one of the questions you might say, well, how are designers going to help us to solve the world's problems? But I like the fact you were talking in the book a lot about, and you mentioned just there about limitations. And of course, one of the things that creativity ironically requires is limitations, because if it's unlimited, it becomes a bit challenging. So working with those limitations is a key function of creativity. And I like the link then to solving, I don't know, what do we do in a resource constrained environment? Well, that's the same dynamics. And therefore, actually, having designers and creatives to try and solve some of those problems. I guess we've let the logical people loose on it. Now, why don't we let the creative people loose on it? Is sort of where you're pointing towards.
Yeah, another word for limits is constraints too. And constraints can often really accelerate creativity. If you're tasked with building a way to get from where you are right now to 5 miles away, and you only have $10 or £10 and the use of 3 boards and 1 tire, right? Wow, that really I don't know how you're gonna do that, right? But you may wanna use those dollars wisely and buy a second tire or right, like, but
Right.
immediately you figure out, like, "Oh, okay, I have to be creative within these boundaries," and you might come up with something totally wild that you would have never otherwise if those constraints, those limits hadn't been applied. We see that over and over again in our classes and how students work. You can do amazing things with those constraints, and it's worth bringing them to how we view the world too.
I was sort of looking through reviews of the book, and there was one in particular that I thought was fascinating. And it was clearly somebody that had approached it expecting the back of the book to be a sort of checklist of what to do or a model, something you could slavishly follow to solve the problem. And so the critique was all about, well, they're not really proposing any solution. And I thought that was really interesting because I kind of went, that's sort of missing the point, right? Because we need to think about these things. This isn't a sort of procedural manual that if you slavishly follow these instructions. So I loved it because I sort of went, that's entirely missing the point. And yeah, that's sort of often how we have tried to solve problems in the past and how many people look at the challenges that we face. We just need a playbook. And you're giving us a playbook, but it's not that kind of playbook.
Yeah, so much about design is really about developing a point of view. We talk about point of view a lot. And as Chris was talking about, in a situation where things are sort of feel unlimited, you actually have to work to find those constraints. And the constraints that you choose become your ethics. They become what you care about. They become what you're going to put out into the world. And so basically what we're talking about is like, actually, we need ways to be able to look at the world and figure out what constraints are important and really create values that we're going to put out into the world. And that's not a stepwise process. It's not like choose value, put into worlds, it's really about, it's really about seeing like, what's going on? What's really needed? How do I approach this in a way that's going to bring things together rather than split them apart? Then you can see what's happening. You start to learn about the system that you're in. And then you can start intervening in a way where you're testing and responding, testing and responding. And it's just a much more subtle thing. And we felt the first step really is seeing what's going on right now. I think a lot of what we've talked about today is, a lot of people feel like there's so much hype around AI. This is not, this is just like the industrial era. It's just like the printing press. I fall on the side that, yes, it's like those things and it's its own thing. And we really need to look at what we're dealing with right now. And that might just be the factor that, I have young kids who are going to be going into the world pretty soon. So I'm, concerned about what's out there, but to take on, not even take on, to make the most of this, really unwieldy situation that we're in, both for better or worse. Really does feel like there's a fundamental difference. And how do we understand that difference and our weaknesses as people in approaching that difference? How do we work within our weaknesses?
And you touched on ethics. And I guess if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd be having a conversation with designers about ethics, would seem sort of strange to me. But it makes perfect sense in the context of there because as you say, these things have consequences. And so as I was reading the book, I was reflecting and saying, well, what criteria do we use to make decisions? What are these constraints or limitations? And you very quickly get into those ethical considerations that you were looking at. And I wondered, I guess to sort of throw at you the critique of me a year ago would be, well, what do designers know about ethics?
I think the ethics within the design community is on the rise recently because our creations reach a lot of people quickly, and we have seen how the things that we make do cause harm. So for us in Scott and I's world, which is data of educators and students, like we're working to embed an ethics curriculum across the design degrees. And the goal is to get to a place where the way that ethics shows up across our classes is additive. So a student would graduate with a plurality of frameworks for which to draw on in their own career. There is no one way, there's no one framework. There's always going to be multiple points of view. How do we give them practice with that as young people in a safe educational setting so that when they encounter these situations in the working world, they have that background to draw on? So that's a way of saying I don't know the exact answer, but it's a really like active thread in our work right now.
I mean, that's fascinating because as you were talking about, it makes perfect sense. You can see that, I guess, and it's back to the tools and the scalability of the tools and where things might go and audiences that might see things would be fundamentally different. And I was reading the other day about this idea of context collapse, where you put something on social media and people who don't fully understand the context might see it and draw conclusions from it, and that can provoke things. And so I think that's a really interesting challenge for you, I guess, because as you say, it's not something you've ever had to necessarily think about before because why would you? And yet I can see that's very live. And does that feel, I guess the way you're looking at it, because you've written the book and thought about it's obviously a necessary part, but does that feel for somebody coming into design at the start of their career, I guess, are they, is this perhaps a generational thing where they would expect to receive ethics training? Because I'm thinking back to when I was first a student, it wouldn't have seemed natural, but I guess maybe nowadays it would.
Yeah, and they want it. They're coming in with a desire to make something that they're proud of. And what proud of means has changed. I think even 10, 15 years ago, it was, I'm going to make the biggest, startup and we're going to have this great digital product and it's going to be fantastic. Everyone's going to use it. Maybe I'll make a bunch of money. Now it feels a lot more like I want to create something that creates positive change in the world. And, we have students who are working on problems where they're not even just designing the product, they're designing the supply chain for that product. They're looking at, how farmers interact with the creation of the product and whether that gives them a good livelihood or not. And that's what they want to do. They're just excited to really, it's not just about the thing, it's about the change that that thing makes, where that's a different way of looking at it. And I think it comes out of the fact that designers have now been playing in spaces and situations where like they are creating these huge social media, disruptions that then have cascading impacts and they want to be responsible for that. So they want to think about how does it all work together?
As you reflect on this, I mean, is this fun for you to think about? Because there's a certain, as I was reading the book and I started with my sort of dystopian, oh, this is all terrible. And then I detected a sense of joy as you were grappling with the problem and coming up with solutions. Is that a fair description? I mean, I know that writing a book is often incredibly hard work. So I don't want to pretend that every moment of the process was fun, but I had a real sense of joy in the way that you wrote. And I guess the way you're talking about it now.
Yeah. Well, one, like, thank you. I'm glad that you feel that sense of joy because we do want this book to be optimistic and leave people with a sense of hope for sure. In terms of writing it, it's worth knowing that, we did the bulk of the writing for this book between, 2021 to 2023, which is a time of like not only the pandemic was in full swing as we were beginning, but also like think of the changes that we've seen with AI specifically in that time period. As Scott and I were writing, the world was changing so fast that some of the things that we had even posed as fiction stories began to come true. And it was like, well, that
That's
can't
not
be
the
in there
future.
anymore
That's the
because like
present, right?
that's
Yeah.
old news at this point. Yeah. And like there were moments where we're like, oh my God, we can't get this book out fast enough. And then there's other topics that for some reasons, felt very much like they'll like perennially be, on the cutting edge, and we'll never quite arrive to them, and they're worth bringing up much the same. So I think our, you know, beyond just joy, it was a very like wild ride of mixed emotions, processing what's happening, and sometimes, like, that's exciting to see, like, something that you predicted actually come true, and other times it's like, "Oh my god, I got nothing left. I have no more ideas." So, we were definitely taking the ride along with writing it, and now I feel really lucky that we got to write our book during that time period because it made us examine it with such scrutiny that I feel like we got to topics that we may not have if it was a calmer period of human existence, if there is such a thing.
One of the things I found interesting about the book is that I started by reading it and then I found it, in sort of logical sequence as one does. And then as I was coming back to it, thinking about it, I found it was something to dive into. And almost there was a part of me just thought I'll just flick to a random page and see where I end up. Because a lot of the thoughts that you're in, it's not back to our friend who didn't understand the purpose of the book, who I think would hate this, right? What do you mean I can flick? It really, it was one of those things. It sort of struck me that there's a lot to be gained, but clearly you want to read the whole thing through. But actually, because of the topics that you've got there, bouncing around is quite helpful. And I found myself sort of just randomly, partly because it's beautiful, by the way. I should compliment you on it's not just really well written, it's just a stunning thing to hold and some lovely, lovely artwork and images in there. But I just found myself sort of randomly flicking pages and looking in and seeing where that took me. And again, that wasn't something I was necessarily expecting from the start, but that's kind of where it sits now for me. Is it's a sort of inspirational piece. I don't know if I just need some inspiration or something, I can turn to it. And I wasn't expecting that kind of book.
Yeah, we're so glad to hear you say that, because it was frankly like a bit of a risky move. And in working with our editor and everybody, it was like a lot of back and forth on whether or not we wanted to do that. But there are two things about it. One is, I think it respects how people actually interact with books now. It's a lot of short bursts of reading. We looked up a study. It's actually very hard to find how people use even ebooks, right? Like, because nobody's sharing the data. Amazon keeps theirs, Apple keeps theirs. But we found one which was like a subsidiary book reader. And what percentage of people do you think actually finish a nonfiction book? Like, finish it cover to cover?
I'm guessing there'll be a ton of people saying they do, and then there'll be the reality, right? The usual
Data
thing.
from the e-reader, data like what
Right.
page did
Yeah.
it
So
actually get
I'm
to?
guessing it's a very, very small percentage of people actually finish.
Yeah, it's sort of like I think one of the famous ones is the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That's 7%.
Which of course is ironic, because that's all about how the way the human brain works. So you would, I was one of the criticisms I make of that book is you would think somebody that understood how the human brain worked would have structured the book in a slightly more engaging way. But we'll forgive him, because it is a pretty thing.
It's a brilliant book. It's a brilliant book, which I haven't finished, by the way.
But so that's interesting. So in a way, you were intentionally chunking it to make it easily digestible as you go through. But I guess then that also lends itself to the dynamic I was just talking about.
Yeah, and so our hope is that you can read it cover to cover, and it's made to, one thing leads to another. But there are 10-page segments, 5-page segments even, where you can sit down and read that. You can read that completely, and you can have a takeaway. And the other thing too is we know it's not comprehensive. We talked in the beginning about these intangibles, which are sort of the forces that make it hard for people to see the harm they're causing. And, there are hundreds of those, we use 4. And so the thing is just to give you a little bit of a hook to start to understand what else you might be looking for, in hopes that, you read about emotions and then you start thinking about make-believe later, kind of, or something else. There's a great thing that we discovered in the writing of the book called the umfelt, which is sort of the sensory experience of any given species. And they're so different, what a butterfly can taste with its feet and see ultraviolet rays, but it can't see depth. So imagine like if we couldn't see depth, but could taste with our feet and could see ultraviolet, how different our experience in the world would be. So our hope is you take that little nugget and then you start to think about like, what else am I missing? Like the question of the first half of the book is, what are we missing?
And I was going to say, because I struck, if I had to sort of summarize the two parts, the first one was what is it I'm not aware of? What preconceptions am I bringing, or what am I not seeing? And then the second bit struck me was very much around, well, break some rules, right? Don't be constrained by your thinking when it comes to solutions, and therefore what rules are constraining me. And I thought, to your point, and again, that's why I thought this review was classic, right? It was a sort of like, it's not about here's every single thing, because you'd have had to write, well, you couldn't have written it, right? Because we can't spot all these things by default. But I love that these are all jumping off points. And so I really like that, because it comes back to the sort of theme of the show about humans. We think we've got visibility on everything, and we think we've got the full panoply of the toolkit to solve the problems. And actually, you're just going, no, we haven't. And let's recognize that. And if we do that, we might come up with some more intelligent ways of solving problems.
Yeah, I'll also add, you brought up the illustrations. Our illustrator, Armando Veve, created these incredible, original hand-drawn charcoal illustrations that both open the two parts of the book, as well as each chapter within it, And then there's also a bunch of spot illustrations he's done throughout. And those illustrations, in particular, the part and chapter openers, excuse me, are amalgamations of the ideas that happen within those parts and chapters that he has then reconstrued into a visual of his own devising and brought, into charcoal. It's so hard to describe this if you're not looking at it, but like the part openers are these almost Where's Waldo-esque images that have different scenes and characters in them. And you could spend hours just looking at those and saying, oh my goodness, like there's that like cat from this section of the book interacting with the tree and the turtle and the ways that those pipes are powering that section of, you know, underneath the ground where the tree is like it's you just keep seeing things. And, you brought up cognitive diversity earlier, Christian, like the way that each of us takes in the world and makes sense of what's there and finds insight. Like, yeah, we're reading differently now, as Scott's saying, but also there's many people that process the world picture first. And you can see that with the rise of graphic novels. Like you go into a bookseller today and there's aisles upon aisles of graphic novels that just wasn't there 5, 10 years ago. And, that was important to us in this book too, is to maybe hook people through the visual first in some instances that wouldn't have seen themselves in this work elsewhere.
And was it always the plan to have visuals in the book, or did that come at a later stage?
Yeah, we've been publishing a bunch of books at the D.school, and they're all very visual. And that's really, again, because we feel like there's multiple ways to absorb the content. There should be multiple entry points into the book. We want to signal different sections so you can leap in and out. We've been doing books for a while now, and I think one of our principles in designing the books is that you should be able to come and go. Like in a sense, like putting down the book and being inspired to go do something. That's the main goal, is to put the book down. But also we want to give you ways in, ways back in. So the images, the different colored paper, that's all an attempt to help signal that.
And I'm smiling because the way you were talking there, Scott, is the antithesis of social media. Right? They're trying to lock you in on the platform. They do not want you to escape. And you're talking about precisely the opposite, right? It's like, it's almost victory if somebody's read a page and been inspired to go
Right.
do something, right? That's success for you. If you're Mark Zuckerberg, that's complete failure.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, like, this came up the first book I wrote, um, which is about designing spaces. And the thing that was just so incredibly satisfying was people would just talk about one part, and they would talk about it so deeply. It was the one thing that they needed to hear. And then it shot them off on like, oh my, I read this thing about, how you have movable furniture. I went and just made all this movable furniture. It was so great. And then I'm talking about anything else. And another person would be like, I loved how you looked at the way people interact. And now when I walk into a room and I look at people, that's all they cared about. And so to some degree, it's like just being able to give somebody what they need in the moment is the best thing. And it's actually very hard to do that. How do you know exactly what they're going to need when? How do you time the delivery of the content just right when the need is there? So any way that we can do that, that's the goal. I mean, yeah, that's the goal.
And you talked about the design of the book, and I'm intrigued. Have you thought about other formats for it and whether it would lend itself to? I mean, video is the most obvious one, but are there plans for anything along those lines?
I mean, I'll say that from the beginning, Scott has been saying, wow, could we make this a Netflix series? So if anybody's listening that wants to work with us on that, like, you know where to find us. Yeah.
It's the not so black mirror. It's the gray mirror.
Yeah, I was trying to work out whether you'd want to be the people who also watched, or whether you want to be completely separate. But it's an interesting thing. And one of the things I know that authors have is that it's not like your brain can stop at the moment of, firstly, because you have to submit months in advance of publication. And so there's your brain, obviously, with the sorts of people you are on the topic, your brains will continue to think. And then clearly having conversations like this and thinking about it, you will have moved on. Is there another book in the offing? What's the next stage on this project?
There's definitely other books in there. I think we're
For sure.
in the middle, like, at least I'll speak for myself. Like, I need periods of taking things in and absorbing and reading and just gathering all that inspiration. And I know, like, what the hook is for me for what's next is just going to manifest itself likely when I'm out walking or, in the shower. Like all those cliches are totally true. So yeah, it's in there. There's definitely things we're paying attention to. I mean, I'm personally very fascinated with our interactions between, humans and plants in the natural world right now, as well as women's sports and how we build and design athletically and what we study and why. And again, I don't know what format any of that might take, but there's something in there. There's something stewing. And I'm sure Scott has a whole slew of his own thoughts and ideas too.
Yeah, you mentioned cutting room floor, and I think like one of the biggest pains of the book, particularly coming out when it did as this technology is coming to fruition, is, you know, the book is finished and it's like at the printer, and then this other thing happens, and we come up with another idea about it. So I think one big thing is recently, I think there's something about the way we're now creating in media, in the same way the industrial era was creating in machines. And we're going to have different kinds of pollution when we're creating in media. And where is that pollution going, right? Like it's not the water and the air, it's maybe our neurons and imaginations. And how do we not make the same mistakes? Like I've been thinking about synthetic things, like we have synthetic foods. Shouldn't there be some lessons that we've learned from synthetic foods for worse mostly that we could apply to synthetic, AI, to synthetic content? Or, I feel like we should be learning these lessons, and I'd love to get ahead of them.
And as design professionals, how do you both feel about the democratization of design? So I'm thinking about things like Canva, for example, and 3D printing, and the ability of everyday, the tools that I, as a non-design professional, have have just improving on a constant basis. So I can do things that were not possible before. And on the one hand, that seems to me to be a force for good, putting tools into people's hands to use for things. On the other hand, we can see the downside of it. And I wondered how you felt about that balance of something that you recognize people, there's this specialist skill there, hence people come and study. How do you feel about that? Where's that tipping point? Because it seems to me that we could go too far with these things, and some marvelous things will come from it, some appalling things come from it. Is there a way that we can balance that out?
It's a really good question, and it's something that like merits a lot of wrestling with as you're both creating a culture or a company where people are building things. When we think about emerging technologies like AI, like synthetic biology, one mantra that we have is you don't have to know the code, but you do need to know what that code can do. And what that means is that we don't need all of us in the world to know how to like program in Python or, be able to do line by line coding. What we do need is more of us to be versed in if I bring this type of, machine learning algorithm, a classification algorithm, and I apply it to a data set that is people's, uh, Yelp restaurant reviews in a certain geographic area, I might be able to do or create what? What system might I disrupt if I am classifying elements based on those reviews in certain ways? And so what that does is like it democratizes the conversation about what these technologies can do and gives a lot more people access to like both being critical and constructive for what they should do. So this is back to the, you know, um, line that Scott said earlier about like not being enamored with what we can do, but instead what we should do. We need all of us in our perspectives, whether you are a historian, whether you are a parent, whether you are working in your local town government. We need we need all of us to be able to weigh in on where we're going as a technological planet. And so, in terms of democratizing tools, like it's about democratizing the access to those tools because knowing how those tools work, like plus the time to tinker with them equates to power to change things. And if only the technologists have power to change, they're going to be the ones defining our future. And I think that we want all of us to have a say in defining what that future is.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, in a way, you could say that the power, something like ChatGPT, the fact that that is freely available to anyone is actually incredibly helpful, right? Because it increases average I don't know if literacy is the right word, but sort of chat GPT or generative AI literacy will increase people's greater awareness of it. And so that's a really interesting thing. So in simple terms, if we put things into people's hands and they get to play with them and they're not, and I guess the problem with things like chat GPT is a lot of people put off because you're really saying put the tools in people's hands. And I guess with some training and explanation around it.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about material literacy in our work. So, you know, I pretty much everybody that's listening to this podcast right now could pick up a piece of paper. That's a material. You can understand how it can fold, how it can crumple, what it looks like when it tears. When it's rolled in a ball, you can throw it really far. If it's a flat sheet, that thing's going to go flip, 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 right? And we know how that material works and have a sense for what it can do, right? And what it can hold, how you could maybe make a box out of it and hold a couple candies in it, but that thing's not going to hold up a house. You know what it looks like when it breaks, right? We have a lot of material literacy with these physical materials like paper, wood, plastic, metal, like that are very visible in our lives. But for the emerging technologies, the invisible ones like AI, like synthetic biology, where things are very complex, you need a highly specific knowledge set to be able to build with them. Like a lot of us don't even know what they do, so we never consider them as tools in our own work. And if you don't know that a material exists, if you don't know that blockchain is a tool for fundamentally restructuring how a system works, you never think to employ it in your work, right? Like if you don't know plastic exists, you would never mock up a design that includes it. So we need that broad material literacy so that lots of people know what tools are available. Yeah, you might not know the nitty gritty about how each of them work, but even being able to say, I wonder if, you know, this type of algorithm is right for me, then you can pull in people that have more expertise and really play it out. But we need to get people to have that baseline material literacy.
And it struck me as you were talking about thinking about the what I earlier referred to as the side effects, but the unintended consequences, or where might this go? It seemed to me that one of the ways that we might be able to start to force change there is to get people to, I think about it in the context of somebody that writes a rule, like some behavioral rule as, and you can create those, but as we know with rules and laws, there will always be loopholes and things that might go wrong. And so actually getting somebody that writes a law to not just say this is an amazing law, but say talk about potentially almost to use your plan and say, okay, this has gone wrong. How's it gone wrong? And to look ahead and to start to disclose those things so that we move from a world of this is amazing to this is amazing, but, or, and, depending on what you, and to start to have to disclose those things. And it struck me that a lot of that is either people trying to ignore it or they don't even think about it in the first place. And so is it helpful to have those things disclosed and to start forcing people, so if you're going to introduce X, if you're going to bring Uber along, you need to also talk about the downsides of it and recognize that upfront and declare that upfront in the same way that we do with drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that drugs are a good metaphor because I think we're not really taking into account how powerful and how much these things have an impact on our health, our livelihood, our relationships. And it is really at the scale of like something like a drug. Now, a lot of these things have been happening. So there's habits called red teaming, where people basically have a group try to break what they're doing and see what the problems might be. User testing reveals a lot of these things. There have been a lot of ethics teams in different companies, but seemingly recently, those ethics teams have been kind of losing the battle, and some people get fired. Sometimes they just don't, they reorg and the ethics team is gone. So the question is, where does it sit? And there's a really great quote from Marshall McLuhan, who's mid-century media theorist. He had the medium as the message is his famous thing, but he has another one, which is the effects come before the causes, which is weird. You're like, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. His point is usually you see the kind of big thing happening before it really comes to fruition. So his example is bikes actually created most of the roads that then cars drove on. So bicycles kind of were around, this need for roads came around, then the infrastructure for cars was already there. So the effect is the infrastructure, the cause is the car, but actually like the bikes, created the effect before the real thing showed up. And I think with generative AI, And like the work that Chris and I have been doing around design fiction or speculative fiction, we can probably figure out these effects pretty quickly. Like there could be an organization that all they do as soon as technology comes out, they figure out what are all the possible effects that could go wrong. And the company doesn't even have a choice in talking about it, because the company is often there and there are discussions about this. They're afraid to talk about it because they're afraid basically they're not going to be allowed to do anything, right? They don't have to be the ones talking about it. We can talk about it because very quickly we can see the effects coming. So the story you mentioned about the we call it love machine, where it's sort of this romantic relationship AI helper. I wrote that story. A student who was on Stanford's campus built a prototype of that same thing. We don't know each other. This was within 6 months, right? These things are coming so fast that we are seeing what's coming. And I think it would be great. We could just have a company that basically does, I guess the crash test dummies, or furniture companies will have these other companies that just test their furniture for wear. Like, we need that. Let's just start that.
Well, because I was reading somewhere that one way to manage it is get Hollywood involved, right? Because they're really good at thinking imaginative about what might happen. And there are certain companies out there who are using Hollywood script writers to do risk management for them, because they're unconstrained by the reality. So they'll come up with ideas. And I quite like that idea. So I love this idea of having you probably have to come up with some slightly interesting name for it, because I wouldn't want to call them auditors necessarily, because it's a bit more predictable.
No.
But I love that idea.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's the side effects or something. Yeah.
Amazing. I could keep talking to you both forever, but we all have other things we need to be getting on doing. Thank you so much for writing an incredible book that blew my mind. That is, and I love this. It's just a beauty, a joy to behold and literally hold in your hands. So I encourage people, don't wait for the paperback of this. Go buy the hardback, right? Because it deserves to be a hardback book. It's a lovely, lovely, lovely thing to have. And thank you also for being phenomenal guests on the show. You've given me tons of things to think about, and thank you very much indeed for that as well.
Well, thank you so much for having us, for your kind words, and it's truly a pleasure to see your enthusiasm for the book. It means a lot, and we're hopeful that it means a lot to others too.
Yeah, and we really got to some new places with you. So thanks for that.
Amazing. Final thing is, if people want to find out more about what you do and the other books you publish, the best place to go presumably is the website.
Yes, it's dschool.stanford.edu/books. And we have all our books there. We've published a dozen in the last couple of years.
Amazing. There will be a link to that in the show notes for people who weren't writing quickly enough so they could find that. But thank you so much, Scott and Carissa, for writing an amazing book and being fabulous guests on the show.
Thank you, Christian.
Thanks, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Carissa and Scott for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Carissa, Scott, their book, Assembling Tomorrow, and the Stanford D.school, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that design is critical, and that what we design today has implications tomorrow. But above all, thank you so much for listening.